Greetings, Andrew. How are you? How's your health?
Well, that's a bit of a long, not very interesting subject. Not so good, but yeah, that's it. It's a bit complicated to explain what's going on, but yeah, well, it's spring, and that also affects things quite a lot as well. So,
where are you at the moment?
I'm in a place called Pärnu, which is in on the yeah. Well, it's in Estonia. It's a seaside town in Estonia, which is pretty dead in the winter and normally very lively for a few months in the summer. But with all of this virus stuff going on at the moment, who knows what's going to happen? So.
What do you make of all of this mass coronavirus pandemic? What advice can you give to people besides the obvious need to remain at home?
Oh, I don't know if I'm qualified to give anybody any advice. The interesting aspects to me are the reactions that people have to what is basically for them an unexpected thing. So, I mean, it sort of reflects the way that people desire very strongly to have security in their lives. And when something comes along which shows them that actually that security is not based on anything very solid, how they deal with that. And it shows a lot, not only on the big scale, politically, economically, all these other kind of things, but on a small scale. And it will be interesting to see just what happens as a result of it, whether anything will change in people's attitudes, because they're being shown something which it's an extraordinary situation, which people have not been in before, or I would say most people have not been in before. And I don't think very much will change. People will want to go back to the way they were before as soon as possible. But a little bit like a piece of elastic, you pull it and it goes back to where it was. But this time, maybe it doesn't go back all the way. Maybe if you pull a piece of elastic long enough, eventually it loses its shape and it doesn't go back to the way it was. Maybe that will happen this time. I don't know. It's a completely unpredictable situation. What it does show, and maybe this is something, hopefully some of this will penetrate to some people. It shows very clearly that everything is related to everything else, that there isn't anything separate, that people are not separate, and that events are incredibly complicated in their effects and incredibly complicated in their causes. And I think that's, if people could actually take note of that and actually make a reality of that for themselves, that would be a very healthy thing. So,
did you expect that this could happen?
Me personally, well, I mean, there were a lot of signs. I mean, it wasn't. The one of the problems is, of course, that this is not something I can personally verify until it actually hits here. So when you read a report on the news these days, more than ever, you're not sure about exactly what the truth of that is. And I mean, where you come from, you should know that better than anybody. I mean, what happens in certain countries is that certain views are pushed and certain other ones are suppressed. And now more than ever, there is a basic distrust on the part of just about everybody, and like what you read and what you see can't be trusted anymore. Well, the question arises, is it because there is more disinformation today than there has been before, or do we just simply know more? And the more that you actually know, the more you're going to see different perspectives on exactly the same thing. So my father was a policeman, and he always used to say that if there's, for example, an accident and there are 20 people who saw that accident, you'll get 20 completely different stories about what actually happened. So the fact remains, whatever that fact was. But, let's say it's a car crash. One person will say it's a black guy on a motorbike, and another person will say it's a little old lady in a car. I mean, I'm not exaggerating here. People will see what they want to see. What actually happens is not actually what people will report, and they will edit reality to fit what they believe should be happening. And this becomes very important once you realize that. It's something you might know intellectually, but once it actually becomes real for you, when you get into a situation like that, where, especially as I'm of a certain age, and histories are being written at this moment. A lot of histories are coming out about the kind of stuff that was done in the late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, late 80s, and so on. And these histories, I've read some of them, and they are so completely false that you're speechless. You can read these things. There have been certain situations where, for example, I have read something about a certain event, and the person talking about it wasn't at that event. I know because I was there. And what they're talking about is being told to someone who is writing a book, and that person hadn't even been born then. So what then happens is that this gets published in an expensive, big book, and that becomes the truth. And it's one thing to know this intellectually. I mean, everybody knows that history is written by people with agendas to push. Now, when it happens to you, though, and when it's talking about something where you were there and you know that that person wasn't there, that becomes a very different thing. That's a very, very strange thing to happen to you. And this is happening more and more as people like, for example, recently Genesis P-Orridge died, and, all sorts of other people who have now passed on who were involved in all this kind of stuff. And then you see what people say. And history is plastic. It is not a fixed, written in stone thing. And to see this happening makes you realize just how much all history must be like this. So it's, all times are interesting. All periods of history are interesting, but this one seems to be marked by a very, as I said before, maybe it's because we know more about these things than we did before, but I think there's a great deal more of this going on than there was before. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But
are you surprised by what is going on?
Well, no, not really, because faced with the unknown, people panic and they want to go back to, security. They're not, most people are not willing to embrace the unknown unless they have some sort of guarantee about what's going to happen afterwards. We are raised in the West, and I suppose increasingly more and more in other parts of the world, to rely on the idea that there'll be an answer at the back of the book eventually. So you can relax, it's like, well, somebody will sort it out. There'll be some solution. There'll be version 2.0 of the software which will solve the problem. Western science has the attitude that if we keep on looking long enough, eventually we will find the answers to everything. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be true, but that is the belief. And that gives a sense of security. That gives a sort of like, well, okay, maybe we don't understand it now, but we'll find a cure for these diseases. We will find a solution to to global warming. We will find a solution to world poverty and starvation and, all this other kind of, somebody will find a way.
What is your opinion of global warming? Is it possible?
Well, all I can talk about is my own experience. And when I lived in Iceland, a year before I left Iceland, the sea in the spring, the sea was 1 degree warmer than it should have been. Now, that's a lot for the sea to be 1 degree warmer than it should be, which meant all of the small shellfish woke up too early and died because there was nothing to eat. So then the birds arrived, and then there was no shellfish for the birds to eat. So the birds died. So you could see this very, very clearly, that something was changing. And the year before I left Iceland, for the very first time ever, the cafes started putting chairs out on the street. Now, that had never happened before in Reykjavik. Never. Because it just simply wasn't warm enough to do that. People were wandering around on the streets in Reykjavik in T-shirts. This had never been seen before. So all I can tell you is that something is going on. Now, it's very easy to read about these things that are happening in other places and say, well, but that's my experience. So I would say that something is going on.
Tell us about the city where you live. What do you think of the human impact on the environment?
Oh, well, I'm old enough to remember when there was no recycling. I'm old enough to remember when everybody smoked everywhere. If you went on a train, you couldn't actually see more than a couple of meters in front of you because there was so much smoke. I'm old enough to remember when people just threw their garbage anywhere. There was, and someone else would clean it up. So with respect to that, obviously there's been a lot of changes about this kind of stuff. I know that, in my lifetime also, there has been a substantial amount of changes in the way that cars are made. When I was a kid, you would see cars going down the street and just clouds of black smoke would be coming out of the back of the cars. Now, anybody with any kind of sensibility is going to see that, well, you can't, obviously, if millions and millions of people are doing that, it can't be good. Again, just to mention Iceland again, unfortunately, but I mean, when I lived in Iceland, there is no pollution in Iceland. So the ironic thing is that cars can pollute more in Iceland because there is no pollution. So the laws about pollution in Iceland are very, very lenient, or they were. They probably aren't now. But that's why they were allowed to do this, because there was no pollution. So again, from what I can see, it's starting to come back. It's starting to be, the evidence is starting to mount up, and there are very few places you can go now where you don't see the results of all of this stuff happening. I remember many years ago even going to Norway, and I went up in just outside of Oslo, and I went up into the hills. And all the trees were kind of looking a bit weird. And I said to the person I was with, I said, "What's going on?" I said, "Oh, it's the acid rain." And I remember going to Budapest. When I went to Budapest, and Budapest, as you might know, has some amazing architecture, old Gothic architecture. And if you look up, there are all these sort of figures, all these Art Nouveau figures on the tops of the buildings. And it looks like they're melting because of all the acid rain which is coming down. And it's obviously, again, I mean, I'm no expert. It's really, not my field of expertise, but it's quite clear something's going on. Quite clear.
In your opinion, what's the use in self-confinement?
Well, that depends on the individual, obviously. I mean, I spend most of my time, I don't go out at all, almost. So, to me, I almost don't go out at all anyway, myself. So it all depends on the individual, what they can make use of it, of course. But probably for most people, the problem is not having enough self-discipline to actually make use of it, because they will just slide into sort of, I don't know, doing very little. And for a lot of people, probably they deserve to do nothing for quite some time. But again, it's a question of the circumstances. It's not a question of the circumstances, but of how people use them. So you might actually, for me, this is very close to how I don't notice very much difference about my life at this moment. So, but for other people, they might be able to use it. But it's all a question of what they want to do. So I don't think it makes everybody do exactly the same thing. Some people will love it, and some people will actually hate it, because it will bring them into contact with a situation where they. Most people are running away from looking at themselves, and if they are forced to look at themselves, they will either find some way to run away from it, or they will deny that it's happening and sort of try to ignore it. So there are very few people who have the sort of self-discipline to actually make use of it, which is a shame. But we're not trained to do that. We're not, certainly in the West, we don't have a framework where we can actually, where we're taught how to be self-sufficient. We're trained to be dependent on either other people or services or systems or, any manner of things. For people to be independent is not considered to be it's not a financially, you can't make a lot of money out of people who are independent. So there's a very good reason why people are being trained to be addicted to all manner of things which cost money. So, it makes sense. There is an opportunity to reflect on the fact that we are actually interconnected, and that such a thing makes it's possible to become conscious of the fact that there is no difference. So it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how much money you've got or how famous you are or whatever. That on this level you're all the same. In which case, there's a possibility that you could actually recognize that situation as being happening to other people, and therefore you might be able to develop some kind of compassion and some kind of empathy, in which case distance doesn't matter. Ask any parent. So the possibility exists for people to tap into what is really humanity. One definition of humanity would be the ability to put yourself into other people's shoes, to consider things from a viewpoint other than your own. So this is something which sets us apart from pretty much all other animals, is that we can actually appreciate the fact that other people have other viewpoints, and but that at the same point we actually have a connection there. So concentrating on other people and and being, doing whatever is possible to assist them and to serve them is one way to get around it. If you're only concentrating on your own uncomfortable situation, your own, it's not really suffering, but your own slightly uncomfortable situation, then of course you're not going to develop much sympathy or empathy or feeling for other people. But if you concentrate on what other people are going through, then maybe you can develop that as a result of this, and then you're not going to feel isolated at all.
March 14th was the day when Genesis P-Orridge passed away, a man who used to be your friend and who you had happened to work together with. How can you comment on that tragic event? What kind of man was Genesis P-Orridge?
It's very double, because on the one hand, there are an enormous number of things that happened as a result of what Genesis did which meant, I mean, there's a lot of things I would never have done if it hadn't been for Genesis. But on the other hand, there's also an enormous number of negative things which were done, which you can't ignore. And the thing with Genesis is that Gen was really a catalyst. It didn't really have a talent other than, I mean, the greatest talent that Genesis had was bringing people together who could actually do things that no one person could do. And Gen had a very, very big talent for that, being able to attract people who could work in very interesting ways together. But there's an enormous amount of personality problems and all sorts of other very unpleasant details about Genesis, which balance this out in a sort of a negative way. And I didn't have any contact for the last years, and there were some pretty bad things happened. And of course, this passing away was not unexpected. So I don't know about tragic. So, I mean, you know, there's a couple of years, everybody had like a couple of years to get used to the idea. And Jen had been talking about it for years anyway. So it was, you know, everybody knew it was happening. It appeared to, I mean, he managed to get a lot of things finished that he wanted to get finished. So it wasn't like it was all sudden and, left a mess behind and all the rest of it. But without going into details, I mean, there's some pretty bad personal things that Jen did. And I think you don't have to look very far to find a lot of very, very bad stories about what happened. But on the other hand, I have to give him credit for having started many, many things, which I wouldn't be the same person. I wouldn't have come in contact with all sorts of things which were important to me. All sorts of things happened because of Genesis, which are extremely valuable. So it's a very mixed situation because there's a lot of very bad things and a lot of very good things. And the influence there's a lot of very good influences and a lot of very bad influences. It's been very interesting to see what people have said and the stories which are coming out and the way that people have reacted to the death. So it's very true that when somebody dies, it brings out the best in people and it brings out the worst in people, just like weddings do. You know, if you look at what Genesis represented, it was on the surface. It was the idea that you should be very, very conscientious, that you should be very penetrating in your look at the world. You should not pretend that things are one way when they are another way. And so if we are to take one of the messages that Genesis, you know, to be honest about the situation, then we should talk about the awful things that happened, about the awful things that Genesis did to many, many people, because that's the truth. That's actually what happened.
Is there any story related to him you would like to share with us?
Well, I mean, there's lots of there's lot. You'd have to give me a little bit of time to think about a suitable one. No, I'll tell you this story now. I was staying in his house in London, and I was sleeping in a room where they had the snake. They had a big snake called Bella, boa constrictor, and in a big heated glass cage. And I don't know if you know, but boa constrictors don't do very much. It's a very big snake, very, 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 very big snake, about 2.5 meters long. A great big thick thing, really. I mean, huge, really, really big thing. And every month he would feed it. And they don't eat dead things. They only eat living things. And so they don't move most of the time. You would think they were dead. And they're cold, right? So they're cold-blooded animals. And I picked up this, he gave me this snake, and I picked up this snake, and it looked at me. It turned its head round, and it looked at me, and it was like looking back millions of years into the past. This cold, and there's no fat on a snake, it's all muscle, so it's a solid, muscular thing. And then he put it back in the box, and he had a baby rabbit, which he was going to feed to the snake. And he baptized it as Jesus Christ and then fed it to the snake. So that's where I was sleeping next to this snake with us. So anyway, but Genesis was very, that story will tell you that, first of all, he was grown up enough to be able to look after a snake, which is actually one thing. Second thing is he was very childish. So baptizing a rabbit as Jesus Christ is slightly funny, but it's also very childish. So it's a good story. Genesis was very, very serious and very, very childish at the same time. So there you are.
Let's talk about the cover of the Fuck album. Is it capable of provoking the public? If it happened to come out nowadays, would it have the same outrageous effect?
I don't know. I suppose some people would be outraged and some people would just go, so what? But, I mean, it wasn't meant to outrage anybody anyway. I mean, that wasn't the point. People can get outraged about anything. I mean, if you give it, given the right circumstances, people can be outraged about just about anything. So that's not the whole thing was, of course, just to be very because before that had been this masturbatorium, which was all to do with seeing female sexuality in a very different way, which was related to the show that it went with, which is Annie Sprinkle's one-woman show about her life. And after doing that and having done her show, I was the lights man and sound man and bouncer and, all sorts of things for Annie doing that. It just suddenly occurred to me, well, nobody's ever done this about men. It's a singularly lacking sort of thing. So the idea was to just be very upfront about it, because mostly that, unless you're talking about pornography, this doesn't come up. This doesn't. This is not a subject of discussion. It's like it's just sort of taken for granted, and nobody had really looked at this, apart from a few people working in, let's say, more esoteric traditions and to do with tantricism or all sorts of other things like that. But in the mainstream, and also you have to remember that at this point in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, there were a lot of people using sex as a way to sell things, but in a very fake way. They were using samples taken from porno films, perhaps, or it was just a way to be a little bit sort of interesting, to a little bit daring. But, it wasn't the real thing. It was just titillation. It was just sort of, and to look at these things very, very clearly and very much in depth. Nobody was doing that. Nobody was really addressing this at all. And that was just sort of time to do that. So what better than to actually show this stuff as it actually is, and not just some sort of metaphor, and not just some sort of, making a sort of a reference to it just so that it would, as you say, good marketing. Or this is a real thing. And that's why a lot of people got very upset about it, is because it wasn't gentle, and it wasn't sort of ha ha ha, aren't we being clever by talking about sex but not showing it, which is what most people were doing. And I'm from Madonna to industrial musicians to all sorts of people were doing this.
What kind of relationship do you have with Franz de Waart's label Corn Plastics?
I don't have any relationship with them. So that's it. Not for years. Not for years. Well, I mean, it wouldn't be right of me to talk about the actual details, but it's not the same problem as with Touch, for example, which is very easy. They just owe me a great deal of money. But it's not. No, that's not the situation with France. It's a bit more complicated than that. But yeah, I mean, no, but I haven't had any contact with him for years.
Not so long ago, you opened a Hafler Trio page on Bandcamp. Could you tell us more about the material that was published there?
Well, I have a lot of. I lost a lot of things in a flood in a basement where I was keeping my possessions in Latvia. So I lost a lot of stuff. And when I moved back to Estonia and I was sorting through all of this stuff, I had to start thinking about, well, I should start going through all this archive stuff. And there was a lot of interviews and all this other kind of stuff. And people have been complaining for years and years and years saying, oh, you should put your stuff out on the internet. Why don't you put your stuff out on the internet? So I thought, okay, I will. Let's see if there really is anybody who wants this stuff. So I started putting out all these lectures and interviews and stuff like that. Well, pretty much nobody actually downloaded them. So, okay. So then I thought, okay, well, there's this other stuff which will never get released physically as a CD or any other kind of media. So I may as well just put them up there and let's see if anybody really wants this stuff there. Well, the answer is pretty much no. So I think there's been very little. Let's put it that way. So all those people for all these years who've been saying, yeah, you would sell low, come on, put your stuff on the internet. Actually, no. So
what can you tell us about the evolution of Hafler Trio's music, the sound collage technique, etc.? What influenced your approach to album creation?
Well, when it first started off, obviously it was it came out of this whole culture, which was it was the first time when all of these different disciplines or arts, you could put them all together. So you could have somebody would make a record and there'd be a reference to a writer, and then you would go and you would find books by that writer, and then you would find that writer was talking about a certain film, and that film would have some kind of reference to some other kind of music, and so on and so forth. And so all of these things is what was the beginning of what we now call multimedia, but that word didn't exist then. And it was that there were no boundaries. It was before that, if you were a musician, that's what you did. You played music. And if you were, if you made films, and you got a composer to do your music and, all this other kind of stuff. But with this blurring of the lines, I mean, the boundaries didn't completely disappear, but this sort of easing up, this sort of gentleness of the borders between these things, it became possible to have these kind of things. And, that was the most exciting thing to me. Because, again, before the internet, and to get these things was very hard. To find these obscure writers and obscure films and obscure records and all this other kind of stuff was very, very hard indeed. And there were very, very few people in the entire world who were interested in this stuff. So it was, you knew everybody. You may not have met them because, again, but you would know them by mail. You would exchange records via the post and all this other kind of stuff. And it was very interesting to be able to do this. So you could treat a piece of music as if it was a piece of literature. You could apply the same sort of techniques that you could mix the disciplines up. And so you ended up with what you're calling collage, but it was it was a lot more than collage, because you were applying techniques from different disciplines where they had not been applied before. So it might have sounded like collage, but it might also have been, if you were to watch a movie, the way that they cut a movie is nowhere near how you would produce a piece of music, but now you could. I mean, nobody finds it weird when you watch a movie and you cut from different times. You can go back hundreds of years, you can flash forwards, you can go backwards and forwards and sideways and all the rest. In a movie, that's perfectly acceptable. But to do that in a piece of music was totally unacceptable. And yet that's what we did. So we would take those kind of techniques and we would say, okay, well, why can't you do that? You know, so that's just one example. So why can't you take literary techniques? Why can't you take stuff from religion? Why can't you take stuff from philosophy? Why can't you? Well, the answer was in the late 70s when all of these things became possible. It was you can. So and that's what was so exciting, because it was possible to do so much, and a lot of very interesting things came out. Now, not all of the experiments were interesting, but that's the nature of experiments, you know. So I've used anything I could get my hands on, anything. And you know, in the beginning, of course, I had almost nothing, literally almost nothing. I mean, I never ever had the equipment that I would have wanted, not ever in my entire life. So I've never had a studio. I've never had, you know, any of these kind of things that, well, most of the other people that I know, they've got at least something like a studio or something like that. I've never had that, ever. I never had a mixer. I mean, for the first, I don't know, 6 or 7 records, they're done without a mixer. So, you know, I just never had the money to do it. I never had, and these days, you know, most of the equipment I have is getting pretty old, or it's broken, or it doesn't work completely the way it should, or it's not powerful enough, or whatever. So, anything I was able to do, I did it. So any chance I got to sneak into somebody else's studio, any chance I had, any piece of equipment, I would see what it could do. I would investigate it. I would break it. I would throw it around. I would torture it. I would anything. So I did what I could with what I had. That's the easiest way to put it, really.
What kind of advice would you give to a person who's interested in making electroacoustic music, sound art, and soundscapes? A brief 101 from M McKenzie.
Don't. Advice. Oh, it's always terrible to give anybody advice. Well, okay. The best thing you can do is examine why you want to do it. That's really the best advice I could possibly give. If you have the right motivation for doing it, then it doesn't really matter what it is that you're doing. If you have the right reasons for doing it, then the rest will follow. But if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, and you will know, if you really examine why it is you're doing, then you shouldn't do it. We have enough. We have enough of this stuff in the world. We don't need more. We need less of it, actually. And unfortunately, we live in a society where to produce things is seen to be a very, very positive thing. And that's, you've got to be productive and you've got to keep on doing things. Nobody ever gets a medal for not doing something. And very often, it's the person who leaves things alone and doesn't do something who's actually benefiting society the most. So we have so many records, we have so many pieces of art, we have so much of this kind of stuff. We don't actually need any more. So if you feel the urge to do any of these things, ask yourself why you want to do it. And maybe there's a better way to get what you want rather than making more stuff. So, that would be the advice. The less noise we have, the better, really.
Let's talk a little bit about Luigi Russolo, historical manifest, The Art of Noises. Would you personally add anything to it?
To Russolo? Well, I mean, Russolo... okay. I mean, it's a long time since I read Russolo. But it was more or less a political thing. I mean, it wasn't the fact that it involved sound was actually secondary. It wasn't really the main motivation behind all of this stuff. It was at a particular point in history where there was a kind of revolution, but it was a weird kind of revolution. And what he was, as far as I understand it, what he was doing, noise was just one thing that just happened to stir people up and get people motivated. I mean, if it had been a particular style of paint, I mean, the Futurists did. I mean, the Futurists had a particular kind of painting, a particular kind of way of painting, which annoyed people and stimulated people and confused people as well. So I mean, I know I don't really have anything to add to it. I mean, it's an interesting historical thing, but it wasn't. I'm not sure that I can't speak for Russolo, but I mean, I think he would think it was pretty weird that people were still sort of listening to old recordings of these weird noise machines today, because we live in that world now. In those days, those sounds were pretty odd, but we live surrounded by them now anyway. So it's a bit like Burroughs and the cut-ups. I mean, we live in cut-ups now. It's not unusual now. So as with most things, eventually a new technique or a new kind of art gets assimilated. I mean, surrealism, which was shocking to all the people at the time, is now used in many, many advertisements. Nobody is scandalized, and nobody wants to throw a brick at their television set when they see surrealism, because surrealism is just it's just like another style now. But you have to remember that people actually rioted in theaters in Paris in the early 1900s when they saw Stravinsky's Rite of Spring with this outrageous music, and there were actually riots. And I can't imagine that happening today, because we're so used to all of this stuff that was so shocking. So I mean, who's shocked by Russolo today? I don't think anybody is.
Philosophically speaking, have you ever asked yourself, why do you make music? What motivates or motivated you to do it?
Oh yeah. Well, it's a long time now. I started doing stuff when I was about 14. So and I'm nearly 57 now. So it's been, it's quite a lot of different motivations over the years. So, in the beginning, it was just it was to be rebellious and to do something strange and to investigate forbidden things and all this other kind of stuff. But it gradually quite quickly grew into a way of constructing something which would help people in the way that I had been helped by the things that I had come into contact with when I was developing. And those were things that changed my life. I didn't want to produce things that were just background material or things that people could just sort of file away as just some. I wanted to challenge people, but not just to annoy them, but to make it so that their lives would actually be better as a result of having examined them. And by making these things that you couldn't just understand straight away, they were like things you had to unwrap. They had to, like the Russian dolls, you had to sort of go into layers and layers and layers, and you had to digest it, and you had to process it, and you had to work with it. And this is you had to put in as much effort as I did making it. You had to put in as much effort into understanding it, because all of the things that I was really influenced by and all the things I really admired were things that you had to do this. You couldn't just open your mouth like a little baby bird and expect to be fed. You had to work with this, and it was a challenge, and it was difficult. And those were the most rewarding things. Those were the things which I learned from. Those are the things where I grew every time I went into this thing and I responded in an equal way, something changed in me. I wasn't the same person after I heard this record or saw this film or saw this play or whatever it was, or read this book, that I was before. And I wanted to provide that opportunity for other people.
Have you fulfilled yourself as a musician?
No, not at all. Not at all. No. Because there are all sorts of things that I would very much. No. There's an enormous amount of things that I would want to do. The thing is, I probably won't get to do them. But yeah, there's an enormous amount of stuff, and it's one of the things that is very clear to me now is that if I was to ever listen to or look at or whatever, go back to my old stuff and to go, yeah, I couldn't improve on that. If I ever said that, you should shoot me. Because they can never be like that. They should never be like that. And I will be able, because I made them. So there's stuff that if you were to listen to them or you were to read them or whatever, you wouldn't be able to see these things that I see. And that's a good thing. So, no, there are many, many projects that I would like to do that I probably won't get to do for one reason and another. So I can't say that I am satisfied or fulfilled or anything like that. And I don't think that's negative. So, there are certain mistakes that I made which my gut reaction would be to fix it, but I know that actually I learned more by making the mistake than by getting it right. So what looks like a terrible thing and a mistake from one perspective is actually the thing which you learned far more by getting things wrong than you did by getting things right. So you don't learn by getting things right, actually. It's when you make a mistake and you see that mistake for yourself that you're able to change something about yourself. If you always get things right and you're always satisfied, well, you don't try to do anything different, do you? So you don't have any reason to. If nobody tells you that you're doing it wrong, then you just carry on doing it, don't you? So so in a way, no, I wouldn't change anything. There's certain things which I would have preferred had gone other ways. But, well, yeah, sometimes it takes many years for things to explain themselves. So what looks like a disaster at one point may actually turn out to be the most important thing anyway. So yes, of course, I would have preferred that this happened or this didn't happen or whatever, but I'm either old enough or stupid enough or both to recognize that actually your mistakes are probably the best things that happen to you a lot of the time.
Describe the main idea behind Hafler Trio in 3 words.
3 words.